I am enjoying the heck out of these books. Hi, my name is Christina. This is the D. Louise book series. And this is where we read books and talk books. And I'm trying to learn sign language very slowly. One of the characters in the book is deaf, and it just inspired me to start learning my sign language again because I think, or is that forget? Because I'm teaching substitute teaching, so I want to brush up on my sign language. So I'm trying small bits. But with Brian's first word he learned was father, and then he's got to learn. I think it's grandmother. Is mother twice, grandmother. So I hope you are enjoying these reads. I hope you are enjoying Beatrice Small. I hope you're enjoying If Then Fridays and Star Trek Next Generation Fridays and Flashback Mondays, where we talk about all different genres. Mystery, sci-fi, paranormal, Regency, contemporary romance, Harlequins, the whole 9 yards. I talk about 20, 30 plus books each video. And of course, If Then Friday, where we talk about at least 10. I try and gather up at least 10 for Fridays. And then, of course, my daily book reviews, which this is. And we are on book 7 of the Gaslight series, or the Sarah Brandt and Frank Malloy series. And this is book 7. And like I said, I'm enjoying the heck of it. Sarah Brandt is she was part of her mother is Elizabeth and Felix Decker, and they are very, very rich. They're part of New York's 400, and due to prior circumstances, with her sister eloping and not meeting their standards, and Sarah marrying the doctor and not meeting their standards with spouses, she has been estranged from her parents, but now she is currently working her way, gradually getting back into their graces. She's been spending more and more time with them each and every book. They did not show up in this book. There is a note that Sarah never actually got to, so we might see that in the next book. But there was very little. Well, Frank did interact with Felix. So there will be some, we don't see too much of them, but those are her parents. Frank Malloy is a detective sergeant with the New York Police Department. And I'm having trouble saying that because of my Eve Dallas with the New York Police and Security Department. And I've done 60 of those books, and I'm anxiously waiting for September for the next book. And we will do that then. And I hope you would check out all those videos too. And so here we go. Victoria Thompson, Murder on Lenox Hill. This is book 7. And we've also got 2 new recurring characters. So we start the first chapter with Sarah thinking about her husband and their past situation. And now she is living with Aggie and Maeve. They came from the mission where Sarah was volunteering the last few books, and it was decided that Aggie needed to be in a home environment so that she could start talking again. It's been thought, they don't actually know yet, but they're assuming that Aggie had a terrifying, traumatic experience that she stopped talking after that happened. So, and Maeve was one of the older girls there, and Maeve was brought in home with Aggie to Sarah's house to assist in taking care of Aggie because Sarah goes out often, sometimes all hours of the night, day and night, to deliver babies because she is a midwife. So she gets a note. She starts the book off. She gets a note Mr. and Mrs. Wilford Linton require a consultation. Oh, and I should point out, spoilers. I was once criticized highly, so I like spoilers. I like knowing what's going to happen. I am a Big Brother fan, and I've talked about it in other videos, and I could go on for a tangent here. But I like watching the feeds, and I like knowing who won a contest. But I will watch the episode to find out how it happened, how they won the game, or how they won the challenge. But I like to know stuff in advance. Who was won, who was nominated. I like spoilers. So to be prepared. I like to discuss my book. I like to share it with you. So she receives a consultation from Mr. and Mrs. Wilton. And then after some resting, because she was out all night, she goes to the Linton's residence, and it's in regards to their daughter Grace, who is probably mentally challenged, but she is high functioning mentally challenged, but mentally challenged nonetheless. That is the term used, or learning disabled situation. So in regards to their daughter Grace, who is, like I said, learning disabled, they suspect she is with child because her lady's maid said that she has not had her lady's time in over 4 months, and she is gaining weight. Also during this time, Frank decides that he's going to talk to Felix Decker once again. His conscience is bothering him. Frank had confronted Mr. Decker about Tom Brandt's killing because Frank's informant had told him in the last book that the name Decker was mentioned. So Frank went to confront Felix Decker, thinking that he was the one that killed Tom. But after some questioning and back and forth, it was revealed that Mr. Decker did not kill Tom Brandt, although he was kind of glad that Tom was no longer in his daughter's life, and he was hoping by the result of Tom's death that she would return to the bosom of her mother and father and give up her midwifey ways, but she has not. So, and he would thought that after all this time she might have forgotten her husband. She has not. So Frank and Felix Decker had talked last book about Mr. Decker paying Frank because he knows that cops are, well, he didn't know. Frank had to explain to him that the cops had told him that it was a robbery, and that was the end of the story. But Frank reveals to him that it was not a robbery. He still had all his money, he still had his watch, he still had his clothing. So it was not a robbery, and Mr. Decker was not aware of that, and he wants to know why the police didn't investigate. And Frank tries to explain to him something he didn't know, was that the cops are so poorly paid that they like a little extra handout to pay the bills if they're going to do a little extra investigating. Mr. Decker did not know that. So they have a back and forth with that. Then Brian goes home to his son, Brian. Frank goes home to see his son and his mother. And Brian is learning lots of stuff in school, and he's learning sign language. And he comes home. Frank hung up his coat on a rack. What kind of, oh, wait, go back here. What did you learn in school today, Ma? Frank asked simply as he carried Brian into their flat. Tell me what he's saying. Mrs. Malloy scrawled at him as she closed the door behind them, but when Frank set his son down so he could take off his overcoat, he noticed she was doing something with her hands that looked suspiciously like signing. She put her palms together as if praying, then opened them up to lie them together. Book. And I will know that if you do it a few times, it means deceased. At least that's what I remember. He's got a book to show you. Frank hung up his coat on a rack. What kind of book? Where did he get the book? At school. He got it for you. Before Frank could ask, Brian came clomping back into the room, his specially built-up shoe making his steps sound slightly uneven. He carried a book for which he was proudly presented to his father. Frank looked at the title, Sign Language for the Deaf. Sign Language, Deaf, 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 Deaf. Uh, His father felt odd in his chest, as if he had swelled or something. He opened the book and fanned through the pages. Inside were drawings of a person making signs, all kinds of signs, and the words for each were written underneath. "What's this?" he asked, his voice sounding thick because of emotions clogging his throat. "What's it look like?" his mother asked him impatiently. "It's a book so you can learn to make signs and talk to Brian, too." Frank had to swallow a couple of times. How did he get it? He asked in amazement. Frank had never purchased a book before. He had no idea how much it would cost, but he knew it would be a lot. Where would he get the money? Where would you get the money? He asked, since she would not have to give it to him. She made a derisive noise. "They wanted to pay me at the school. Can you imagine? All I do is look after the boy. He's too young to leave there all day long, no matter what you think." Brian was pulling on his pant leg, demanding attention. Frank handed him the book, and he immediately plopped down on the floor and began looking through it. "I told you, you don't have to stay there with him all day," Frank said. "There's teachers there to look after him. And they've got a room full of children to look after, too. What if Brian slipped out? Who'd notice?" They'd had this argument before, so Frank gave up. He knew his mother would have to accompany Brian to and from school. Since neither of them wanted him to board there, Frank had imagined she might enjoy having her days free while he was in school. He'd been wrong. So they're starting to pay his mother a very, very small salary. Then later we flick back to Sarah and the Lintons, and Sarah does an examination, and she does confirm that Grace is with child about 6 months or so. The next day, Frank goes to Felix Decker and tells him that he has decided to take him up on the offer. Decker's low opinion of him, Frank's pride would take a beating, but it wouldn't be the first time. He'd survive. And more important, he'd be in a position to protect Sarah from whatever he found out about her late husband. "I hope you're not going to waste my time again today, Mr. Malloy," he said coldly. "I hope not, Mr. Decker. I thought a lot about your proposition yesterday, and I've decided I should take it." "Why?" I could use the reward you offered." The words came more easily than he expected, but he couldn't stop the hot wave of shame that poured over him as he held his face rigid, expressionless. Decker considered his claim for a moment. "For your son, I suppose," he said finally. This time the hot wave was fury, but Frank managed to hold his temper as tightly as Decker gazed. "Yes," he managed through stiff lips. "He's a cripple, I believe," Decker said, pausing to see if Frank would react. He didn't, although the effort cost him dearly. "Or he was," Decker continued. "Didn't David Newton operate him? David's father and I were at school together." Frank saw no reason to reply. Decker obviously knew everything about Brian. Had Sarah told him? No, he couldn't imagine her discussing the Malloys with her family. Decker must have investigated him. How ironic to investigate a man you wanted to investigate someone else. But he supposed a man like Decker didn't things like that all take time. He did nothing for granted and trusted no one. When Frank didn't reply, Decker said, "But he's still deaf, isn't he? Your boy, I mean." Who else could he mean? Frank simply said, his fury all gall in his throat, waiting for Decker to finish demonstrating his superiority. "So you want the money to take care of your boy," Decker said. "Yes, Mr. Malloy, I know you wouldn't do this for money. I saw your reaction yesterday when I made you the offer. What really made you change your mind?" And it all comes down to Sarah. He wants to do it for Sarah. He wants to be her hero. So we get a little information about what happened with the girls. We were told in the last book that Sarah was thinking, trying to figure out what to do with Aggie because she really liked Aggie. When Sarah had first considered bringing Aggie to live with her, Mrs. Ellsworth had volunteered to take care for the child when Sarah had to work. Mrs. Ellsworth is her neighbor, and her son is Nelson, who Sarah helped clear of wrongdoing a few books ago. And I like to do Mrs. Ellsworth, and I'm going to do a podcast later on of Mrs. Ellsworth's sayings. Sarah could never have asked her to do such a thing, and she'd been relieved when a volunteer at the mission had suggested that one of the older girls would be an excellent nanny for Aggie. That decision had already allowed Mrs. Ellsworth to play grandmother to the girls whenever she liked, a situation that suited all of them perfectly. And she comes in and they're baking a cake. And it's a simple 1-egg cake, Miss Ellsworth says. Do you want to finish mixing it, Aggie? The girl picked up the spoon that lay on the table, but she didn't get a good grip on it, and it fell from her hand, clattering back onto the tabletop. Oh my, looks like we'll be having a visitor, Mrs. Ellsworth said. Is that what it means when you drop a spoon? Maeve asked with great interest. In the week she'd been acquainted with Miss Ellsworth, she'd learned that the old woman knew a superstition for practically everything that happened. Only if the spoon falls on the table. If it falls on the floor, then it depends on how it lands. If the bowl is up, then means good fortune. If the bowl is down, that means disappointment. The bowl is up. Does that mean our visitor will bring us good fortune? Maeve asked. Even Aggie was waiting eagerly for the answer. Sarah wanted to groan. She didn't want the girls to become superstitious, but she also didn't want to hurt Mrs. Ellsworth's feeling. We'll bring disappointment to our visitor if the cake isn't ready when he or she gets here. And of course, the visitor is Mr. Malloy, and he comes to see her. Do you need help on a case? Malloy's expression had been careful, neutral, but her question surprised him into almost smiling. She saw the flicker of it in his dark eyes before he caught himself. No, I thought I'd stop by to see if you need any help delivering babies, he replied, deadpan, delighting her. Then come inside so I can start your instructions, she said. We knew you were coming, Mr. Malloy, Maeve answered. Aggie dropped a spoon. A spoon? Malloy repeated, giving Sarah a puzzled glance. Mrs. Ellsworth, she offered an explanation. Malloy nodded in perfect understanding. And they talk about Brian. They want Brian to come visit. They like Brian a lot. He's a cute little kid. So he talks about Tom with her. He gets her notes. He takes Tom's files, and he goes to study them. Sarah goes to the Lintons next day, and Mrs. Linton has some friends over for tea. And I like this little cute moment when it's revealed who Sarah is, because they just know Sarah as the midwife. They do not know who she is. Unlike her daughter, Mrs. Evans appeared full of life, energy, although her hair was mostly white and her face lined with age. Did Grace say you are a nurse, Mrs. Brandt? Mrs. Evans asked, probably wondering why someone of such low social status was paying a call on Mrs. Linton. Yes, I am, much to my parents' regret. Sarah rarely revealed her family background, but in this case she knew she needed to make an exception. They didn't approve? Mrs. Evans asked. No, they would have preferred to see me married to one of the Astor boys, I'm sure, Sarah said, shamelessly referring to the wealthiest of wealthy families in New York. Mrs. Evans wasn't sure whether Sarah was simply bragging. And who are your parents, Mrs. Brandt? Felix and Elizabeth Decker, she said. Even Mrs. Linton's jaw dropped at this. She would have no idea of Sarah's elite social connections. Mrs. Evans needed a moment to absorb this information. Well, she said, before she could completely compose herself, and then may I ask how you know Mrs. Linton? Since Mrs. Linton may be high in the status, but she's not as high as Sarah's folks, and she just says it was a private thing. So I love these cute little moments. They're just great. So Sarah talks to Mrs. Linton. Frank goes to talk to Dr. Newton. He wants to inquire about a condition called dementia prasia, and Mr. Newton tells him to go talk to Dr. Quinn, who has recently been learning and getting taught under the teachings of Sigmund Freud. There, that is a name for you. Sarah later goes to deliver a baby, and then she gets a note from her parents, which she did not read, what I mentioned previously, and we have still yet to hear the what the note was about. It seems to be forgotten in the book. She did get a note from the Lintons, so Sarah and Aggie do make go see the Malloys, and she tells Frank about the Lintons and he agrees to go talk to them. Frank's mom is a little jealous of Sarah, just a little bit. Frank's mother doesn't want to be hospitable, but Frank encourages her to be hospitable. So she's like hospitable between her gritted teeth. And she's having a pie. Malloy followed her into the kitchen where Mrs. Malloy had set 2 additional pieces on the table for them. This looks delicious, Sarah said, taking her own seat before Malloy could pull out the chair for her. No sense giving Mrs. Malloy anything else to be annoyed about. Malloy was glaring at his mother, and she was staring defiantly back. Come on, Malloy, Sarah urged. You know apple pie is your favorite. Mrs. Malloy's head snapped around at that. I suppose you've been baking pies for Francis then, if you know his favorite kind. Oh, no, Sarah said sweetly, and he should be glad I haven't. I'm not a very good cook, but my neighbor is, and she likes to please Mr. Malloy. She does she? Mrs. Malloy asked, considering this new information with a worried frown. I suppose she's a widow. Sarah caught Malloy's eye. They both knew what his mother was thinking, another desperate widow out to catch herself a husband. Oh, yes, Sarah said, and Mrs. Ellsworth is extremely fond of Mr. Malloy. You gotta love it. You have to love it. So Frank goes to the church where Grace goes to church because it's the only time that she's out of the house. It's the only time where she interacts with other people, because they're trying to figure out who fathered Grace's child. And then Frank reports back to Sarah that she didn't get anywhere. So then Sarah decides that she's going to investigate the church and the reverend. And it gets a little creepy for me, a little uneasy. I know where this is leaning. It's going. We've been through this a lot. It might have been going on when she was writing this book. What year did she write this? 2000. Oh, way after. Remember all that stuff with the priests and the boys in the early, I think it was the 90s. I'm not exactly sure. But they had all the scandals, and they were telling they had to have priests move and stuff and change dioceses, and some of them were expelled for all their behavior with young boys. And the chapter 6 is just creepy. And Sarah gets the wrong impression at first. She's leaning one way, and it isn't until the pastor's wife goes, "You idiot, it's the other way," but we'll get to that. Frank goes to talk to Dr. Quinn about dementia praxia. Premature dementia precocious madness is disused psychiatric diagnosis that was originally designated a chronic deterioration of psychotic characters by rapid cognitive dissentation. It was a made-up term they used way back when. Sarah gets a note from Mrs. Linton. She's worried about Sarah's visit to the church because it spurred conjecture on why Sarah was there. and Sarah says she didn't say anything. Then then Frank goes to see Edna White about Tom Brandt. She was one of his patients. Sarah goes to talk with Mrs. Upchurch. It's just really, it's leaning this way. You're thinking of, this day and age, it's not, the laws haven't gone into effect yet of protecting minors from superiors like teachers and priests and all that kind of stuff. There's no laws as to this as of yet, but it's a whole bunch of creepy, icky things. But it does happen. It is real in this world. So more discussion happens, and we'll just let it go. So when they discover what the real situation is, they go to talk to all the family members, and then the family members decide that they don't want this to be public. They don't want the newspapers to know. They don't want to have to go to trial. They don't want to have the children talk to anybody about it. And so they decide to take matters in their own hand. And what they're going to do is that they get the board together of the church, and they decide they're going to let Mr. Upchurch go. And it leads to a climactic, dramatic, there's so many different things happen. Mr. Upchurch passes away in the middle of Mass. Salvation in Death, Eve Dallas, J.D. Robb book, the priest dies at the altar. The priest dies at the altar. Little similar thing there. But there's a whole bunch of twists of turns at the end. Who the culprit is of Grace's situation, who the culprit is of Mrs. Church's situation is, who the culprit of Reverend Church's deceased situation. I'll leave that to you. I won't spoil all of that. And then she started a couple of books ago, and they get longer as the books go on and more detailed. But I enjoy the author's notes at the end. I hope you enjoyed this book. Your support has made the Gaslight Mystery Series a success and help ensure that there will be more books to come. I've heard from some fans who were interested to know why I chose Brian to learn American Sign Language instead of attending a school where he could learn to speak. After researching the various schools of thought about teaching the deaf, I came to the same conclusion Frank Malloy did. If Brian had lost his hearing after he had learned to speak, I would have sent him to a school where he learned to speak. Since he never heard the spoken word, my research indicated that those who are born deaf have a difficult time learning to speak. I chose to have him learn to sign. And I'm glad she had him learn to sign, because I think that's the best way to do it. That way the person can communicate with everybody, and nobody has to worry about misunderstanding or worrying about how words are pronounced or anything else. Sign language is universal. This is mother in all languages. This is father in all languages. The spelling of the words may be different due to the languages and their alphabet, but hi is hi in every single language in the country, in the world. You can go to Japan and go hi, and everybody's going to know you're saying hi. I bet if you go to Spain or Italy and wave hi, they're going to know you're saying hi. So just signs, hand gestures are a part of life, and I think that's really good. So I am looking forward to the next book in our series, Murder in Little Italy. This is a little interesting. We will get to that later. So please check out Murder on Lenox Hill. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for joining me. This is a really good series. I'm enjoying it. Thank you.